light in the darkness. Family Life International presents the conference of 2009 with a number of renowned speakers including Bishop Patrick O'Donoghue. For the best quality recordings, contact Family Life International, P.O. Box 4771, London SE 94ET, or telephone 0208 857 9950. The website is www.flionline.org.
The talk actually is countering the forces which undermine our children's faith. Now, the whole theme of the whole events today is really very, very much about that. I hope with this talk you will appreciate where we are now. Now, since we started this apostolate, I've had the privilege really of speaking to probably thousands of young people, teenagers, and also to speak to their parents, which I think is incredibly important. And one of the things I often ask them is this: what is it you want for your children? What do you want them to be like? And when they think about it, this is typically what I get. They say they'd like them to be healthy, they would like them to be well educated, well informed, have great careers, marriage and children, typically. And we have a tendency of thinking purely in the earthly. We tend to think purely that they are secure at an earthly level. As we go on with the conversation, I then ask, well, do you really care whether they have a strong faith, a mature, strong faith? Is that important to you? Do you really care whether they have the courage to actually make those difficult choices? Do you really care whether they are faithful to the church's teaching on the whole range, most of the topics we've been talking about? Do you really care if they live in a state of grace, that they're receiving the sacraments regularly? Is that something which concerns you? Do you really care whether they have a Christian perspective, a Christian worldview? And unfortunately, a lot of parents seem to be less concerned with that. They don't, somehow the whole Catholic formation, the whole way we see the world, never simply occurs to them. So I then start talking to them something about giving their children Catholic formation. Now, this is something Daphne was talking a little bit about, certainly something which was done in the 50s and prior to the 50s, and really changed very much in the 60s and beyond. So what's a Catholic formation? Well, it's really an intellectual structure which governs a whole range of things, how we see the world in general. It guides basically our consciences. How do we know something is right or wrong? What is good and evil? Are these interchangeable? That whole process. It also tells us something about our religious obligations. It also tells us something about our moral obligations, our moral and spiritual obligations, and it also prepares us for our responsibilities in the wider world, our social responsibilities. It helps us to understand the meaning of manhood, of being a man and being a woman. That again is blurred, because now we have a whole range of other genders which are now introduced to our children. It helps us to embrace our obligations of our vocation. So if we're single, if we're married, or if we're going for the religious life, it helps us to do this. Still further, it gives us, helps us to develop the view of God's plan for us. So irrespective of our status in life or where we are, whether it be physically in the world or what we are currently doing, it helps us not only to embrace that, but to moving forward. And so finally, it helps us with our relationships with others, particularly in terms of the respect and dignity of human life. So one of the things I don't talk when speaking to parents, I can say, so tell me, what do you think your child will be doing when they're 21? Do you think they, for instance, with your daughter or son, would they be going to Mass regularly still? Will they still be living a sacramental life? Will they be doing works of charity? And would they be maybe supporting the vulnerable, the unborn, the poor, the elderly? Well, is that what they're doing? Or possibly, would they be cohabiting? Would they be in an intimate relationship outside of marriage? Does that concern you? Will they be on the pill? Would they be involved in some respects in abortion, whether it be by helping others or because of their acts? Would they possibly be on drugs? Do those things concern you? Now, the reality is that we need to understand what outcomes are, and if we understand what the outcomes are and we know the choices which brought about those outcomes, we can do something about it. And the whole issue of pornography now, not only on mainstream television, but also on the internet. If you look at the statistics associated with this whole space, they're staggering and they're scary. And unfortunately, I think parents kind of today live in a different world to their children. I know when I was growing up, we seemed to live in the same world as our parents. There wasn't the idea of teenagers do totally different things. For me, I lived in the same world. I understood what my father did. I understood what my mother did. We were involved in terms of the work of the home. I knew what my parents expected of me. So let's look now at choices, and that's important because it ties very much into a Christian formation. You have to think, what makes, when you have a child into a young adult, possibly into marriage and family life, what are the key elements which help them to make those choices? For the order, you can see basically a baby, a toddler, a teenager, possibly a university graduate, to marriage, and then to a family. Or alternatively, you have another alternative. What choices were made, and how did those, and what was the formation which guided those choices that a young person moves in a totally a different direction? And that's what we're going to look at a little. Okay, so you have to understand, and I'll emphasize a little later on, that we actually live in a secular society. And therefore, the formation your children will get, unless you personally do something about it, will be a secular formation. That formation will build their belief system and their value system. And from that, they will express behaviors. The behaviors they act out are dependent basically on their belief system. And that will touch on things like lifestyles, what they consider to be right or wrong. We talked a little about it. Their whole moral values. When I talk about lifestyles, we're talking about whether they marry or whether they cohabit or all the other variations we now have a choice of. It'll impact on their health. For instance, you probably know that we're currently in an epidemic of STDs. These are lifelong health conditions. And it depends very much on those choices and the lifestyles our children take up. And it impacts on the social and clearly the spiritual, whether they believe in God or not. Okay. However, if you give your child a Christian or a Catholic formation, as it will impact on their belief system, it will impact on their value system, which tends to be very supportive not only of marriage and the family, but also the dignity of the human person. And the behaviors, again, they will have a Catholic worldview. And so all of these things are changed. What you have to consider is this: if they have a formation which is grounded in the faith, the choices they make, because that's the view they're looking at, will be very different from the secular choices. They will express the behaviors because they're looking at, for instance, if they understand, for instance, to cohabit or to use birth control mechanisms are intrinsically wrong, evil, they will avoid that. They will understand, they understand that, and that is not the space they want to be in. And the outcomes associated with those behaviors tend to be good. If they have a secular worldview, we'll see in a second where that takes us. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the religion of our society, which primarily I call secular atheism and materialism. I call it SAM for short. It shapes our children, our worldview, and our children's worldview. It defines their belief system, their value systems, and goes on really to encourage them to take choices which tend to be anti-Christian, anti-Catholic. If they're told at school, birth control or you have it, look, often kids will be told at school, hey, you'll never have control over your passions, whether it be your sexual passions or whether it be your eating passions. So what you have to do is use this device or this particular chemical mixture to control them, because you'll never have the self-control. Whether it be, and it's whether on eating or any of the spaces. If you think about it now, we tend to live in that world whereby we use external products to control ourselves. Back in my parents' generation, we just use self-control. Of course, and this is one of the reasons why we currently have the difficulties, whether it be in abortion, euthanasia, an explosion of single parenthood. All of those come from a secular mindset, a secular formation. Just going to run through some statistics, the current statistics. Now, if you do nothing different to the rest of the population, let's say you're a Catholic, you have a family, and you do nothing different to the rest of the population, you can expect about 70 to 85% of children currently going to Mass, currently religious, to stop going to Mass by the time they reach 18 years. And their belief system will be indistinguishable from their non-Catholic peers. We see so many young Catholics, young people now who see no problem in cohabiting. This is not a difficulty for them. Just go on a little further. About children between 5 years and 5 and 11 years now are all given very positive views on the issue of homosexuality, homosexual behavior, homosexual lifestyles. Very positive. So we can guarantee the next generation, children now 5 and going up, as adults, they'll have a very positive view. They'll be sort of told, well, this is an option. This is this may be a lifestyle you'd prefer to choose. About 80% of young people will cohabit, will have premarital sex and cohabit before marrying, as if they marry. If you've seen the stats, more women today now have a child outside of marriage than marry. 100% will be introduced and encouraged to use birth control mechanisms. Very, very positive spin on that. About 62% of young people will conceive a child outside of marriage, and about 30% of them will actually abort the child, or will kill the unborn child. About 50% of them will be infected with an STD, and about a third of those being a lifelong STD. About 40% of them will go through a divorce, 33% of them will have a drunken one-night stand, about 75% will have an encounter with drugs, about 15% will become addicts, whether it be drink or drugs, and all will have been exposed to pornography.